Hello there, everybody. Good afternoon, or evening, or morning. Happy Friday, unless it's not Friday where you're at. I guess it is Saturday in some parts of the world, although it's pretty early in the morning there, so I wouldn't be surprised if there's no one tuning in from, New Zealand or Australia or otherwise in the Pacific. They're probably all they're probably all sleeping in after the GeoCart conference, which I wish I could have had an opportunity to go to. Ibrahim, good to see you here. Always reliable attendee of my streams. Thanks for checking in. For the rest of you, please feel free to say hi in the chat and let me know how you're doing. Today, it's been several months since I did one of these things, so I came up with another random idea for something to live stream about. How am I doing? I'm doing okay. It's summer, it's nice out. I'm doing better than I was doing a few months ago. It's been a tough year. There's been a lot going on in my life, and I would say that's why I haven't streamed very much, but that's not the case because I don't stream a lot anyway, even when things are great. But if this is only the second stream I've done with this background because I moved at the start of the year in February. So that was one among a wide variety of life stressors going on. And things are still kind of a mess here. There's a closet door that someday I will put back on the closet to which it belongs. But it's been up there since January, February. So it's not going to happen anytime soon, probably. Because I had to take everything out in order to put this floor in here. You can see bits of brown behind me. And then I finished the floor and I decided I was never working on this place again in my life. That's not really true, but it's a long break. So yeah, this is my office in my new-ish place. The outside is right over there. There's a major intersection, so you will occasionally hear bits of traffic noise. I've closed the windows up to help minimize that, but just be prepared for the occasional siren, which is it's kind of like where I used to live. I lived near the airport where there were the jet fighters and there were the trains, so I'm farther away from those, and now I'm near the ambulances and fire trucks. So there's always something going on in urban living. All right, so let me just check one thing here. So I'm just looking at my connection details here. It says I have a good connection, making sure that, because based on where my computer is positioned now, I can't easily plug into my router. So I'm broadcasting from Wi-Fi, and so hopefully that does not get spotty or cause me to drop frames or anything like that. If that happens, we'll pause and ride it out and then do this another time if we need to. But in the meanwhile, today I'm going to talk to you about this thing, the Historical Atlas of Canada, and also this thing, the second volume. And there's a third one down there on the floor. I'm not going to pick it up. These are heavy. These are big. It's interesting that when I think about atlases, I think about things that usually think about oversized atlases. I've made atlases that are definitely smaller than this, but I don't know, there's something imprinted on my brain that says like, oh, that's not a real atlas. Real atlases are giant things, and I've got big National Geographic one over there on my shelves, things like that. So it's definitely maybe that's one thing that draws me to this particular set of books, is just because they're giant. They're not super oversized, but like the one that they're showing off right now in New Zealand, which is one that's, I don't know, a couple of meters tall at least. It's huge. And, if you look at people who are attending the GeoCart conference, they'll have, photos on their social media and videos of that going around, which I hope someday to see that in person. So let me just give you a little background on this book and why I bothered to talk to you about it at all. This is one of the only atlases that I own, and I feel like I'm kind of unusual for people in my profession. in that I don't own very many maps, either as single maps or as atlases. I remember at the start of the pandemic, Ken Field started a little hashtag game on Twitter in which in which he asked people to tweet out their maps from home, like just show off maps that you own. Take pictures of your walls or wherever you've got some maps, or mugs with maps on them. And everyone was getting in on this, and I realized I own one map that is sitting like as a single print somewhere on a wall. That other than a couple that I made that are sitting around, on shelves and things like this for, tests or eventual sale. And that's about it. And I have just a couple of atlases, too. So I don't know. I feel like that makes me unusual. I guess maybe, I don't know. Do I like maps less than other cartographers? I don't think that's true. But I don't know. I don't tend to keep physical maps around. I don't even keep my own stuff most of the time. So that's just me. But I do own the Historical Atlas of Canada. And this was kind of imprinted upon me in graduate school, 10, 12 years ago. Has it been that long? Yeah, 12, 13 years ago, as an example of something really great. My advisor, Mark Harrower, who was Canadian, so I don't know if there's some bias in there, he always called it like one of the last great atlases in the sort of the pre-digital cartographic era. And I think, when you're getting into a field, when you're starting to learn about something, your taste is influenced by other people. What other people tell you is good, you start to find that to be good. So I think it was sort of formational for me, the way that baby ducklings imprint upon their mother. This is good cartography, and we would see examples of it in class all the time. And so what I mostly want to do is take my love of this book and just share it with all of you and sort of spread it out here on the internet. And maybe you'll find some things that are inspiring through that. So be prepared for some. Here, we're going to shift you over. First off, I've got my phone propped up on some cardboard to act as a little overhead camera, but for the most part, it's not going to be close enough to really see what's going on. So eventually, I'm going to be picking the camera up here and grabbing it and pulling it down over the book. So just be prepared for some unsteady camera work as I wander around and show you these things. But we're just going to start at the beginning. And please, all of you who are here, all 6 of you it looks like, feel free to chime in with your own comments and thoughts and things that you see that are interesting or stuff that you want me to go back and take a look at. There's a bit of a lag on the live stream, as is pretty usual, so it could be, you type something, it could be a little while before I see it, but if you want me to go back to something, we can definitely do that. So the first volume here, I'm not sure exactly when it was published, but the inscriptions on the bottom, like little forewords and such, are I'll say 1987. I know this was worked on through the late 1980s, and the last of the 3 volumes was published in 1993. And we're not going to look at every single page. Between the 3 volumes, there's probably about 500 or 600 of them. But we're just going to start and thumb through a few of these things as examples. And I will kind of call out some things that stand out to me, and I can't show you the whole thing anyway, because I'm sure that'd be a copyright violation if I were basically taking photographs of the whole thing for you. So let's start at the beginning, and with some ice sheets. And I really love the manual shading that's going on here with all this glaciation. This is a skill that there's not a lot of people left who can do, a manual shaded relief. In this case, they're not showing mountains, they're showing sort of lobes of glacial ice. But, I imagine it's pretty much the same kind of techniques you would use to do a shaded relief map. And it's still a skill that I would love to acquire one of these days, although that's not going to happen anytime soon. This is one of comparatively few maps in this book, too, that takes up kind of the full spread here. So the binding is pretty good at laying flat, so you don't lose much in the gutter here. But let's just kind of move on to sort of some more thematic spreads. This is pretty much a thematic atlas. There's a little reference material about here's where this island is, here's where this river is. But for the most part, this is a thematic atlas where each plate, and I'll just bring in close so you can see for a second. Each plate has an author, and that author is basically the, I think, if I understand correctly, and we'll look at some information that might correct me, that's the sort of person that they consulted with, the cartographers worked with to create the whole plate here. Because there's a whole team of cartographers, each working with, they find some historical expert in this case, particular cultural sequences in the north of indigenous cultures, and figure out, well, how can we show your data? So that's, so you're going to see different authors on each of these things. And what I really love about this book is sort of the dynamism. I'll pull this back for a second. The dynamism of the layouts. Because for the most part, you're going to see, a whole bunch of charts and graphs and maps all on each plate, which takes up a 2-page spread here. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if you got that locator, 6 maps, 2 charts, and all of it is laid out very dynamically. There's every single spread here has a very different look than any other one in terms of where they've arranged everything. And I really like that. I've worked on an atlas or two, and when I worked on, for example, the ecological atlas of the Bering, Chukchi, and Beaufort Seas, which I can pull up a thing here. Let me switch over here to this thing. So when I worked on my ecological atlas, for example, you can see there's this spread with Alaska on it. And then here's another spread with Alaska on it. And pretty much every map had the same base map in the exact same position. So that was, and that was useful for what we were trying to do. But it also led to things maybe being not as dynamic, maybe in some ways not as interesting, although I think it's still a pretty great project. Oh goodness, it says YouTube is not receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming. So are things stuttering in a problematic way? Are you able to follow along reasonably without anything being too bad? Let me know, chime in, otherwise I can pause for a minute, do some troubleshooting, and then maybe come back online if we're having some problems. But this could just be the fact that I am not able to hardwire directly into my router. All right, a few frame drops, but it's all right. Thank you, Ibrahim. For what we're doing, I'm not trying to do the most complicated stuff, so maybe we can just bear with it. And maybe someday I'll get like a really long Ethernet cable that can snake from room to room, and then I can plug into my router and I have a little bit better connection. So, in a lot of atlases, if you're doing the same region over and over again, you're just going to use the same base map over and over and over. It's always going to look the same, and that's fine. But they're constantly laying things out differently, even though they're actually just using the same map of Canada over and over. So that's kind of one thing that really stuck with me, and I have no idea how long it possibly could have taken to figure out what is the ideal arrangement. Somebody says to you, we need, to turn to a random page, we need these, 10 charts, a photograph, and these 2 maps, and we got to make it all fit in this space. Like, what's the ideal way to do that? And I think it's just a lot of trial and error. And it's, and it's important to understand, this was in the manual cartographic era that they were doing this. So to go back to a question in the chat from Mr. Sati1, is it a group of mappers or company of one, or one author or company? So this was produced at the University of Toronto in their cartographic laboratory, and the chief cartographer, who is, I think he's credited here somewhere in the inside, is Jeffrey Matthews. So Jeffrey Matthews there, but he's the cartographer designer. But if you actually go in and look at the one of the forward pages, prefaces, there's a list of names here. So I'll bring this in. Be ready to get motion sick for a second, but let's get those in there for a second. And you can always pause the, if you're watching this video later, you can always pause. But you can see there's a whole group of names here of people to be thanked. Julian Brown, Byron Moldovsky, Dan Poirier. I don't know how to say some of these names, I'm sure. But these are the people who did a lot of the cartographic work. And so if I've read the sort of the introduction to some of the other volumes. So I accidentally turned my phone into. Sorry, paused my phone, and then so it stopped the camera for a second there. Okay. So when you're looking at a spread like this, it's generally one person per. And the thing to understand, I read one of the preface of one of the other volumes. This would typically take 2 to 3 months for one person to produce. Any one of these spreads was a 2 to 3 month affair. I don't know whether that was from the initial consultation of figuring out what the data were going to be and what they wanted to show, or whether that was once they had a plan, it took 2 to 3 months to create. But it's a huge amount of work, so I have a lot of respect for the level of detail that they were able to assemble, because this is the sort of thing that this would not be easy in a digital era, but it would certainly not take 3 months to assemble something like this. And if I were to put this together digitally, I would have a lot of advantages in being able to say, well, I've got this map of France, I want to just nudge it over a little bit, or I want to move this label, and it would take me a few seconds to play around with some different ideas. So I would not have survived in the manual cartographic era. That would have been, that would have just been so hard to have to draw each individual piece out over and over and over again. And if you're interested in how some of this was constructed, this is not something I have any experience with. And have any of you worked with scribing and photographing plates for printing? I know that was something that was sort of common in cartographic production up through the 80s and early 90s, but I've never done anything like it. But if you are not familiar and you want to know a little bit more about how this works, I'm going to look up something here for you to share. If you go to the NASIS YouTube channel, that's My Professional Society, there was a talk by David Nuttall. So you can look up this video, and I will, I'm not going to play it right here, but maybe I can paste that in the chat there so that you can, if you want to see it. He goes through, here's what it was like to draw these things in the late 1980s. It was a lot of work, and I've seen the instruments that they used for them, and so I know a little bit about it. But sorry, I actually wanted to show you this. Yeah, okay, so there we go. So manual cartography, 85 through 96. So back to our document, though. So some things that I think that stand out to me right away when I look at this thing is the color palette. It feels colorful, but I don't know, I want to say subdued. It feels colorful, but a little bit restrained. It's not super saturated that you tend to see, I think, in some of the, that ecological atlas that I showed you. I've done some really bright, colorful, thematic cartographic work, and I think that tends to get put in front of people's faces now, especially in a digital era where, on screen you can have a much brighter color palette, for example, than you can in print. So there's definitely something going on with probably with the transition in color palettes there. So that's one thing that stands out to me. The other thing that pops out to me is a small detail, something that I've tried to borrow just a little bit in my own work, but I haven't quite managed to find very many situations yet in which to introduce it. And that is the way they use coastlines and all these with all their thematic data. And I can probably find it even if I turn to another spread here, for example, on, let's going on? Pre-loyalist Nova Scotia. So when you're dealing with, layering thematic data on top of other data sets, oftentimes it can be very hard to find the land and the water boundary, the coastline, because you've got big circles all over everything, or big flow lines and things. And these are the kinds of reasons this was shown to me when I was a graduate student, because it was a really good example of thematic cartography done well. And one of the things that I really love is if I pick you up here on my camera once again and bring you in, so be ready for the unsteadiness. We're just going to get in real close. Just a little simple trick is notice the coastline continues directly over top of the proportional symbols. I love that little detail because it means you don't have to, for example, turn the proportional symbols transparent, which is the kind of thing we would do now, right? You might see people making a thematic map out there, and they would just take these things and they turn down the opacity so you can kind of see through what's going on, see the land, water, figure ground distinction. But that would not have been easy to do in this time period of manual printing. So they just separated they have two layers. Instead of a land layer with what we would call nowadays a fill and a stroke, they simply have the fill layer, and then they have the thematic layer, then they have the stroke layer. And I do that sometimes, and I think it's a really nice technique that was forced by circumstances. It was forced by the idea that you can't, you couldn't easily do transparency in that day and age. And the way these things were constructed in the manual technique suggested this is the best idea. And now that we're not forced into that, we don't do this as much, but I think that's a nice little trick. And you can see, to a lesser degree, the same thing going on over here in this flow map. You can see some areas where that blue is overprinted on the other things. So it's just kind of a nice little fun idea. We'll just bring you back up here to the overhead position. I should show you my little setup, actually, just for fun. So, there we go. I just got a piece of cardboard with some other cardboard glued into like a little holder. And there's more professional setups, but this is like the only time, this is probably the only time I'm going to show you a book. So I am not, it's not worth investing in anything to make this a little bit more proper. I do see now why sometimes my video might be stuttering. Apparently it says my computer is slightly overloaded in what it's trying to show. I made some tweaks to my video settings versus last time, and I guess I upped the quality a little bit too much, so it's just ability to process things is a little bit slow. So that must be what's going on. So for next stream, whenever that is, months, years from now, probably not years, but months, I'll see about fixing that. At least it's not my internet. So just thumbing through. I love those stacked flow arrows there. That's nice. And again, that's all manually constructed. Somebody had to draw the perfect curvature right there, and then draw the same curvature at a slightly different radius over and over and over again. There are some things that, while I love the layouts and the dynamism and how there's just so much going on and it's different each time, there are some things that I'd probably do different if I were in this position. And I think sometimes the text feels a little tight into the edge. You don't even need to be able to read the text from, I know you can't read it from where the camera is, but you can see the text is just right up into the edge of the map, which is a little bit unfortunate. I think I wish they'd given a little bit more white space, but maybe there are some, there may be some reasons for that I'm not presently thinking about. Who knows? One thing I just noticed too when I was looking at this a little bit earlier is the way that they feather the edges of these maps. And this is another thing that I don't see very much nowadays, and it's again forced by circumstances, but I think it's a style that would be nice to bring back. So we come in really close here. You can see the way those maps fade off at the edge, right? And this is the kind of thing where today if you were making something digitally and you wanted to stop the map right here, your options are basically, you could stop it with a hard line, which they could have done when they were printing this atlas as well. Or we might do a gradual fade away, like basically a gradient of opacity where things, transition smoothly from purple to white, the paper color. But this has got this sort of, and it's happening all around here, it's got this sort of fun little stipple effect. And I don't see that very much. And again, they couldn't have done very easily sort of a smooth gradient drop-off, so they have this sort of stipple version instead. And I'm really curious about how I might construct something like this if I were to do that now, because I feel like this feels in some ways, this feels like a more natural transition to me. I don't know, there's something more organic about it because it's full of random noise. It's not perfect. So let's head on over to Photoshop or Adobe products of some variety, and we'll see. I'll show you what I mean. I switched away from the camera before putting it back just to avoid disturbing you. So let me do a little attempted reconstruction here, because I'm really curious about what we might be able to manage. I do have a mind. This reminds me. I would like to maybe in a future stream try and take one of the maps and reproduce it. I tweeted out something about this recently, actually. I think that there's a lot of value in taking other people's work and just copying it, because it teaches you a lot when you're forced to break down all the little details of how is this thing made, what are all the little elements that went into constructing it, and you can learn a lot of technique. And it's also easy to, it's also we face the blank page problem oftentimes as creatives, that we decide, I want to make a project and I don't know what to make. And if you're copying somebody else, then you don't have to worry about what to make. It's already there. Somebody has got the style down for you. They've got the design. Oftentimes the data are already all there. So I actually would like to create sort of my own little thing, kind of like the 30-day map challenge, where people do different maps every month, or different maps every day for a month. I would like there to be like duplication December or something like that, where the challenge is, within a month, copy somebody else's work and, give appropriate credit to the original. But that might be a future live stream where I'll take one of these pieces and just say, how closely can I copy that? But for the moment, let me just show you what I'm talking about. When I say feathers and gradients, and let's see if we can find a way to duplicate what's going on here. So I got some patch of blue. Let's pretend this is the edge of our map. It's water or something like that. And what I might do is I might feather that off if I wanted to end my map. So I might mask that, and I might, in the mask layer, take my mask and use the feather tool to feather that mask some. Yeah, so it has this sort of smooth gradient drop off, and that looks, it's fine. It's more gradual than just cutting the map off like you would, but it does look kind of artificial. So I'm trying to think about how I might do this, make that stipple gradient like they're doing in the Historical Atlas Canada. And I think, like, if I had a gradient, I could, actually, let me make this a black and white gradient. And I've got this with all my tools shrunk here. It's a little bit hard to find. There we go. Shift this to black and white. What's the shortcut to make it black and white? Oh well, I'll just do it this way. Oh, my color picker came up off screen. It's like, why won't it focus the window? I think if I wanted to make a black and white gradient, instead of smoothly transitioning, I bet if if I added noise, okay, I'm going to have to add noise in another layer. And you can't add noise to anything that's empty for some reason. I don't know, so I had to make a copy. So I've got the copy of the gradient and I got the original gradient. So put the copy on top. And this is not the most thorough explanation because this was not quite my focus today. This is just a quick run through to see if we can do it. All right, so we're going to turn this into some noise. Just fill that with noise. So we got a gradient and we got noise on top. Noise, gradient. And let's make that noise partially transparent. So there's some noise on top of the gradient. So now it's a noisy gradient. And if I merge those two together with Command E, and then I do a threshold. Not quite what I'm looking for. I may have to experiment with this in another time. I might require like median smoothing these things to clump them together. Yeah, see, that got kind of clumpy. So I may not have a solution right now, but I may have to experiment and do. Oh, that's kind of right. Do a tutorial at some point when I figure it out. Alas, but a little live experimentation there for you. All right, back to our atlas. So, going to figure this out. It's going to be great. I'm going to do it on my map sometimes because I like it when maps fade off gracefully if they're going to end before the edge of the page, at least. I usually like to print full bleed all the way edge to edge, but I know that's not always practical. Let me see if I can find some things that show examples of other kinds of things that go on here. Sometimes they've got some historical photographs or paintings. In this case, paintings in this era, but as we get on, there'll be historical photos. What they also tend to have is sometimes very detailed, they tend to have these little microcosms spread throughout. Besides, big maps that say, like, here's what's going on in a large chunk of Canada. They'll do these little things off to the side about, like, here is a small fort. I'm going to bring you in now. Oop. View my camera, yes. Right, here is a specific fort that we happen to know a few things about, as far as where the French and the Haudenosaunee and very such like were at that time. And I suspect that's partly, just as a way of showing that there's so much more complexity when you see what's going on in the big map. Let's just zoom in on just a few examples. And that's also partly probably because this is one place that we happen to know about, just because of documentation, archaeological evidence, or the specific historian that they were talking to, this person up here, BG Trigger, maybe happened to know about this specific data set being available. But I just love those little snapshots that tend to come in. It's not just this big sort of zoomed out picture of every possible sort of, fit the whole country or large chunks of the country on a spread. So I really like that. So we'll do like one more from here and then move on to another volume. Oh, the house. Okay. So this is like, yes, here's what a rural house looked like in this part of the 18th century. At the beginning, here's another example. So it also shows a little bit of historical context. Like here's some house plans. That's kind of fun, but it's still interspersed with 3 maps of all of these different corridors. I love that you can see. This is the thing that I find charming about print. You can see the registration error. And you can see where the plates were slightly misaligned and the orange doesn't quite cover up all that white area. This is the thing that I find charming with physical print, especially older stuff where registration errors tend to be a little bit larger. See if I can see, can't see as much over here on this one, so maybe that was, there's a little bit down there. That's kind of fun. And again, you can see the river running through the proportional symbols, right? You can see all that hydrographic base map data. And that's worth pointing out that they reused a lot of stuff, but it still took 3 months on average to put one of these things together. So let's move on to a different volume from this set, because by the end, an interesting thing to note, by the time they made it to this third volume a few years later, they were doing everything digitally. But it still looks largely the same. You would be hard-pressed to realize that any of this stuff is particularly different in its original construction. They talked about this a little bit in the preface, but they used digital tools to cut the production time to 1 month instead of 3 months for these individual plates, which is still a long time. And again, they're using early 90s computers, so I'm sure things were much slower than what we might be dealing with now. But they did such a great job making everything match. I mean, these layouts, even the little feathering, it's still the exact same way there, and maybe they were bringing in some of the same film production techniques that was just supplemented by digital, but just to make it all kind of fit together in one continuous atlas, which I think is brilliant. And here, as you start to get into later time periods, you've got a lot more thematic data to play with. You've started to get censuses, in the 19th and 20th century. You started to get newspaper articles people can look over and pull data out, and more detailed numerical historical studies. And there are a couple of things I want to look for and see if I can find examples of to show you that are ideas that I really love that this thing does in its layouts, and here's one. So if you're familiar much with the geography of Canada, and actually let me find a different map, because these play around with the geography of Canada a little bit, so let me find one that is more true to, there's some nice manual shaded relief there, look at that. I mean, you don't get that softness in digital relief. That's a skill I definitely got to pick up someday. I'm going to have to ask Sarah Bell for some tips someday, because she's gotten really into that in the last few years, if you have followed her on Twitter or seen her talks at NACIS. Yeah, so I'm just looking for like a whole Canada map or something like that. Okay, it's like down here, right? You've got, this is not all of Canada, but this is sort of the provinces rather than the territories up here. If you compare this thing, or this one over here next to it in that shape, to what they're doing over here, notice here or here what they've done, and I'm just going to bring you in a second, is they've zoomed in on just this area and just kind of stepped on the rest of the map. And up here is the same thing as well. Right? Because there is not, in many cases, in the other parts of Ontario that are hidden under here, there's not as many people, for example. And whatever particular statistical data that they're having, there's not as much of that going on. I've called these before, I've written a blog post about it. I call these in situ insets. And I think it's a brilliant idea, and I've never really seen it anywhere else, where they've basically taken, and ordinarily when you zoom in on a place, you put that zoomed in map off to the side, somewhere else, out of the way. Here they're just say, we're just going to step on part of the main map, so that things still kind of flow together in something approaching the topology of the real geography. And so they do that all throughout here, especially as they start to get more and more statistical data that focuses on kind of the more populous areas, because if you're not familiar with Canadian geography so much, a vast percentage of the population lives along this kind of corridor here. along the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence, on the axis between Toronto and Montreal. Yeah, so there's another one, for example, where they're just stepping on the rest of it because for this particular data set of development of technical and commercial schools, there were none that were founded in those areas that are being hidden. So they can do that. So that's an example that's the kind of thing that I really love. There is another example here, because I've written about this on my blog before. I'm gonna look for some of these and set this down while I page through. There's another couple of fun things they do with these insets. Oh, there's a very traditional inset. All right, we're just gonna see detail. There's your detail, because they couldn't step on these areas because they're actually dots. They have a couple of these fun little pull-out insets that I'm going to look for, that I've seen before. There's, hundreds of plates among all these 3 volumes, so who knows where I saw it. That's the challenge, is finding something you've seen before. If you don't, I look at this and I get some inspiration from it, but I don't have it all memorized by any means. Oh man, there's another big one. Look at this whole map, but this whole area this big inset of British Columbia just kind of steps all over chunks of Alberta, because this is where all the detail was for, in this case, whatever the particular map is. Over here, various relief projects to unemployment relief work in the 1930s. Oh yeah, here's one. So here's another way that they handle insets that I think is kind of fun. So notice they've got this area here, and then just little arrow, pull off. We've pulled it away from the map. Here's another version of it. Same thing here, pull off into that. Which I think is more fun than a little box. It's just this little fun 3D kind of thing to do. And there are all kinds of examples, I think especially more in the later volumes, and I don't know if this has to do with computers or not, where they do these little pseudo 3D kind of symbols with like these charts here, for example, or little stacked cylinders on this map down here. And a lot of people tell you, to be wary of doing 3D work on your charts and graphs. And I think that that's fair. I think that it's easy to do things in a way that obscures what's really going on, but here it's pretty harmless. I think that it just adds a little bit of visual interest without interfering with one's ability to read things. People will tell you, for example, don't do 3D pie charts. Here's some simple flat pie charts, but if you were to take this thing, skew it on an angle, your ability to correctly read these areas or angles or what have you would be really messed up. But I think that there's plenty of room for just these little simple fun effects. And this is kind of a very 90s visualization thing too. But I just think they're very charming. And one thing I really like about them is, this brings me to another point that I try and exhibit in my own work, is that it would have been very easy to just do a single cylinder with color. In this case, this is various union affiliates of the All-Canadian Congress of Labor. And so if you look down at the legend, you can see, okay, well, these are different unions, lumbers, railway employees, etc. And so they're showing you, here in Montreal, there were X number of unions of this kind, X number of that kind, and this kind, and so on. I'm a big fan of countable symbols. One of our common urges cartographically is to make symbols that are proportional. To make circles or squares or lines or whatever that grow in size based on the data. If you can divide them up into a countable unit, I think that's much better. Aggregate symbols versus countable symbols. Let me see if I can find any more examples anywhere around here where they do that kind of thing, because they definitely pull that trick out a bunch of times in this book. And that's actually where I started to learn about this idea from. There are some other maps I've seen that do this, and of course, now I'm live on the internet, probably not going to find them. But yeah, actually, I can probably just show you my blog post because I've got examples in there. So let's bring you back to the internet for a second. So if you head over to my blog, something about maps.wordpress.com, you can look up tricks from the Historical Atlas of Canada. I did this in 2014 and certainly found more things to enjoy since then, but I talked about these in situ insets, for example. We just saw this specific map up here. The non-boxed insets and gridded proportional symbols. So here's another example, and who knows what plate this is on. Finding it in the actual book would be tough. And I don't have the legend here on the map. I just showed an example of the map itself, so who knows what these data actually are. But you can see, instead of just doing proportional circles or squares, it's all broken out into sort of an aggregate of small symbols. And the nice thing is, it doesn't take anything away from your work to do that. For the most part, most readers, when they look at proportional symbols, are going to say, hey, here's more of something over here in Toronto or Montreal, and here's less of it in St. Hyacinthe or Sherbrooke. Okay, these still work in this way. But for somebody who really wants to dig in, they have an opportunity to actually count the symbols up. If I had to scan the legend here and figure out, okay, well, there's a little over 4 units here of whatever this thing is. This is an idea that I know goes back much further than the Historical Atlas of Canada. This is where I started to think about it when I was looking at this book years ago. But this really kind of goes back to the isotype movement, which is something that I've talked about a number of times here. If I can find some good examples here. The isotype system of design and graphics and such that I'm a huge fan of, and I've talked about a number of times on this channel, but they oftentimes, occasionally they did these, when they were designing these things, people who followed this sort of school of design would make things larger or smaller, but oftentimes they just did a whole bunch of symbols, repeating over and over. Countability, making small countable units was generally more of their sort of ethos, and I think there's a lot of value in that, because it's also a lot easier to compare. I mean, if there weren't numbers written above this one here, 145 versus 77, it'd be hard for me to tell. Is this one in the middle twice as big as the one to the right or not? I don't know. If I can count, it's a lot easier. Although I will tell you, there's no substitute for just writing numbers. Don't make people count if you have a chance. That's what I tell people. That's what I would probably tell the people who design this atlas spread for Historical Atlas Canada too. If you've got space, write the numbers down so people don't have to count in the first place. That's a great idea. Fireplace says, sitting there watching with your wife and dog. Well, thank you. Welcome, Fireplace. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate all of you being here, really, just to hang out and think about cool map things. It's vaguely like being in a classroom, again, because this book is one that I would nerd out about with my students, and you can still find copies of it, I should mention, here and there. I picked mine up as old library copies originally. Some libraries were getting rid of it and they put it on a used book website, so I picked the volumes up at different times from different places, but I probably paid $10-15 each one for my initial set that I purchased. Eventually I got a different set, slightly nicer condition, because a few years ago I was honored to be invited to pick through the library of the late David Woodward, who was a cartographer and map historian who taught at the University of Wisconsin and was active in the latter half of the of the 20th century primarily, and he passed away a couple of decades ago now almost. A few years ago, a lot of his books were in storage, and I was invited to basically, me and some other people were invited to go pick through and take things we wanted, and he had a nice pristine set of these atlases, so I picked up a second set and gave away my original set that I'd bought. So they also have a little extra just specialness and niceness to me, just because they belong to somebody important in the field, and they've got that sort of pedigree to them. So we'll do a couple of more before we wrap things up, just because we're winding down toward the 1 hour mark. But please also, if there are things that you're seeing in here or questions you have about this set, my observations do not need to be the only ones here, because I have, I only have so many things to say other than, isn't this interesting and pretty? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to swap out and put the middle volume in, because we looked a little bit at the first volume, the third one, and we'll just browse and once again appreciate. Right? It's a very chill kind of stream where I don't have too much specific to say. Oh, I found that exact. Hey, look, here's that same thing that I just have on. I switch back over right there on the desktop. Yep, there it is. And there it is. So this must be what I scanned it from. So what do these things, what do these symbols mean? It's down here. It says manufacturing value added. 1 cube represents $1 million. Okay. So this is about non-indigenous land use and agriculture, fishing, mining, forestry, and manufacturing. Okay, so there we go. Now at least we've solved that mystery of what's going on here. And they do have the numbers, actually. I know you can't read them, but these are the numbers that go along with these things. So I said add numbers. They put them over to the side, so that's great. I mean, it's nice if you could put them directly on the symbols, but I understand it's a little tight. And that's the other thing. They've managed to fit so much information on a lot of these spreads, but it's all very carefully layered to be clear, and that goes for the layering that we talked about with the proportional symbols and all the other thematic data, and the coastline kind of being dropped on top, but just everything that they're trying to cram in there. So here we've got a spread of dots and then some squares for, who knows what, population maybe, or, population. That is one complaint I will have. The layouts are very dynamic, but you don't know where to look sometimes for the legend. Because it could be anywhere. If you're putting the same map over and over again in the exact same spot, then the user very quickly figures out, okay, the legend is always in the lower right or upper left or whatever. Here, there's a legend up there. If I swap over, here's a legend that goes with these 4 maps. For this map here, okay, there's a legend that goes with this map. For the stuff that I'm seeing here, though, the legend is over on the other page down here in the middle. I mean, they're not terribly far away, but that can be a challenge if you're going to lay things out inconsistently. So I just want to balance that praise that I gave earlier. Say that I really like the fact that the layouts are just all over the place. They're playing around with the space constantly in this atlas, and I think that makes it more fun and interesting to browse through, because you're seeing a very different, you're getting a very different feeling from each page every time. But that can mean that you gotta hunt a little bit more. But I think that's fine, because this is not a book that you just quickly browse through. I mean, all of these are maps where you have to sit down and spend. And I'm gonna bring you in one more time, so if you're ready, close your eyes if you get unsteady. All right, these are things where you're just gonna sit here and you're gonna spend, just to look at a piece of a map like this, you're going to spend a long time. right? Browsing through and picking out each little interesting piece of data, because they've got, okay, here's, this is exports of forest products. All right, so we've got, let's see, how many data sets do we have here? We have the size of the circle is the value of the exports. Okay, so we got, more valuable exports, areas of less. Then, of course, we've got what type of forest products. Saw logs, firewood, sleepers, whatever that means. Timber spars. So these are proportional pie charts. It's broken out by the different kinds. And then, of course, we've got, the two colors of land here. So let's see, areas of exploitation. That's going on. And then we've got these exports to Great Britain going on here. So we can see a chart on top of these. Oh man, that's really cool. The way they've got all these flow arrows coming together, like these are all the exports coming together into a Sankey diagram. Basically, the width is proportional. The flow width is proportional. They all add together with the dollar amounts. And then, on top of that, these are all going to Great Britain. And then we got a chart there saying, breaking that out. So that's, 4 or 5 data sets there. If you don't want to count the base map of, water, like land, water, rivers, province boundaries, etc. So there's a lot going on here. One thing they didn't do, which I appreciate, I don't think they needed to do, was, since they have the numbers written on here, there's no key that says what the arrow thickness represents, because I think that would have been unnecessary. It's a pattern that's apparent, and you got the numbers right on there, so that's fine. So that's just one part of one spread, and just, you could spend 5 minutes at least, maybe more, looking at this and really figuring out the patterns. Okay, I see that over here in Quebec they're doing all this, and the patterns change down here in Montreal, and they exploit all the way up to here, and then this is where all the money is going. And then there's the actual text you could read that explains all this stuff and sort of gives you some context of what's going on historically and how these pieces all fit together, and points out in annotation some of the patterns you should seek. So this is not, I think that's fine that it takes a little hunting. I think it's just sort of the atlas. You've got to really know what you're getting into and sit down. This is not just a casual reference atlas to quick check the name of a country or something like that. This is dense, so I can understand why they were saying it takes 3 months to put together just one of these plates in the manual era, and still a month in the half manual, half computer era, because there's a lot going on. So I love things like this, and it's nice to have an atlas that you can basically sit down and read like a book in terms of its sort of density of information and ability to provoke thought. So set you up there. Alright, just a couple more real quick. I just love the color palettes, like I talked about before. They're colorful without being oversaturated. And that's something that I might want to practice emulating a little bit. So if I do follow through on that plan that I talked about of, maybe trying to reproduce one of these maps, probably won't be one of the big ones like this one. It'll be somewhat smaller, but it'll be good to practice a few different palettes that are slightly other than my own, and the kinds that I often tend to deal with, which are a little bit bolder, a little bit more saturated. So that'll be kind of fun. Yeah, it's a great series. I fully agree with my advisor's decision to point it out to us and say, check this out. I'm going to use this for my examples for class, because it's full of everything from the big to the small, and shows you sort of all the classic thematic map techniques of prop symbols, dot density. There's a little dot density in there, not as much, but that's not as popular. Flow diagrams. There's choropleths. So they do a little of everything, and they do it really well. Okay, well, it's been an hour, and that's usually around how I like to leave these things. So, yeah, we had a little stuttering today. Sorry about that. I'll fix fix some of my settings, but it sounds like it wasn't too bad as far as the ability to get done what we need to get done for just sharing this. But mostly, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to see that this exists, and maybe go check it out. I did look. There's a website, but unfortunately, it's it's a website that uses Flash, so it's super outdated and won't work on most computers. But they did have an attempt, apparently in the 1990s or maybe early 2000s, to try and get some of this material online. But those days are sadly past where that works, and it doesn't look like anybody has updated it since then, sadly. There is also, I should mention, if you do look around and you think you want to own this, but you don't want to buy all three, there is a concise version where they basically took all three and crammed them down into the volume same size as one. So they've sort of kept some of the more major. I don't know how they made those decisions, but some of the bigger threads of the story. So as is traditional, there we go. Just a moment to say thank you so much to my generous patrons who, give me a little bit of financial support that encourages me to do weird random things like this, because it's not like you could probably have a job paging through old Canadian historical atlases, or people pay you to do that all day. So it's nice to have the flexibility and opportunity to do these things. So I appreciate them, and I appreciate all of you. You're supporting me just by being here. Right, just by tuning in and saying hello, sharing your thoughts and greetings, and from wherever you are in the world. So, thanks for tuning in from Chile, I see, and I know you have folks from Egypt, etc. It is always amazing to me how global these things end up being. Even in a group of, when I only have 6 or 7 people tuned in, probably none of them will be from the United States, or maybe one of them. So I really appreciate the opportunity, especially to connect with the global cartographic community, because I don't usually get to otherwise. I go to conferences that are in America, so it contains people from the United States and Canada primarily, and a few Europeans. So it's nice to meet up with all of you in this way. So I'll be back at some time in the future. I'm not exactly sure when. Could be soon, could be a little later, but I do want to try and make one of these maps again. I want to take probably one of the smaller ones and just say, can I reproduce it as exactly as possible? And the colors and the line weights and the styles and the typography, and see if we can match it, because engaging in that act is really useful to figure out, things that can go in your toolkit for the future. And I'm always looking to expand my toolkit. So this will all kind of depend on my inspiration and how much other stuff I have going on in my actual job when that happens. But please do stay tuned. If you want to check me out on Twitter, or if you just head over to Something About Maps, you can check me out on Twitter, visit my portfolio, see my tutorials, etc. So follow me on Twitter, or follow me on my blog. You'll kind of catch up on the biggest things that I'm working on at the time. But with that, I appreciate you all tuning in, and I'll catch you all next time. See ya.